This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis starts off today's show. He explains the recent headlines, including reports, new World Screwworm announcement, meatpacking industry investigation, and consumer demand. The show continues as Kelsie, Doty, and Reannan from K-State's Fashion Studies explain what the best textile choices are for people when their goal is to stay warm and dry. Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, wraps today's show discussing pond and fish management for the winter months. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, wanting to touch on the topic that most people have heard quite a bit about last week, the government reopening, and what does that mean from your perspective?
Yeah, government reopening is obviously going to talk about a lot about the reports that we're going to see in the ag markets. Some of these reports have been delayed. Some of them, the government has still been collecting the data and will release them over kind of a longer time frame. And others, we're just going to have gaps in the data. And so as this kind of shutdown kind of unwinds and we start to see some of the reports, especially since we're right at harvest time for crop production and we're going into, a lot of heavy consumption months for certain meat cuts, I think that will be really important as we start just to evaluate, where the market's at from production standpoint. What does this mean particularly for, things like herd rebuilding and ultimately what this means for price?
And on Friday, we got a WASDE report. Did you see anything important or see any impacts from that?
Yeah, the WASDE report gives the kind of supply and demand estimates for there, but, little known is that we also have kind of the beef segment and the pork segment in the WASDE as well, but it's a kind of a quarterly. So from kind of corn production, really the expectation, trade expectation was that they would be at 184 bushels an acre. November came in at about 186, and that was a little bit down from September, about 186.7 bushels per acre. Beans were kind of similar. Trade was expecting a little bit higher than what it came in, but really when we think about where we're getting this kind of information, it has a lot to do with kind of private reports, and a lot of information from USDA was suggesting that they didn't have all of the money available to actually do the full surveying. So when we think about kind of where we'll be at in the next month, will be probably a more accurate of where we're at than kind of the November. So I'm kind of like a wait and see on some of the kind of the corn stuff, but it has some implications for the beef industry. So when we think about kind of where that is for beef production, they're kind of estimating basically reduced steer heifer slaughter and really kind of slowing marketings really even into the first half of 2026. They have some other estimates on kind of beef imports, but it's important to know that these beef imports talk about kind of expected changes. And so even for 2025 and 26, we've talked a lot about Argentina. They're saying beef import forecasts are essentially unchanged. So just to kind of show you that, even though an announcement can be made, kind of where that gets built into these reports has a lot to do with kind of where the market moves. And we saw how the market reacted this past Friday.
And what has the market looked like?
Yeah, this week was really kind of volatile, really kind of bouncing. There wasn't real, trade information to go off of. We saw basically a limit up for live cattle futures. And then really we just kind of started bouncing around. We did end up a little bit higher this past Friday, but really kind of all over. Things will start to kind of resettle. When we look at just kind of the volatility in the market back to October to where we're at now, the market's essentially dropped about $20 a hundredweight across most of the contracts. So that's about 10% of the value essentially lost in the contract, just to do kind of combination of just basically information coming out and really government uncertainty about what was going to happen. So where that market kind of leads, and if we can continue to be kind of bullish on the market given the underlying supply, I think we're going to have at least support for it in the data as it comes out over the next 4 weeks to 6 weeks.
And consumers are really important for our cattle market. And are they seeing that the prices are changing for what they're buying?
Consumer prices, specifically what we're paying for beef at the retail counter, has really become front and center. If you weren't aware that beef prices were high over the last month, you certainly were made aware that beef prices were higher. Now, what that means is, do consumers actually then react to that by not buying more beef? And it is true, beef has been more expensive. Take a sirloin steak, for example. Back in April, it was about $12.20 a pound. Right now in September, it's about $14.30. So it is real that prices have kind of been sharply higher over the last several months. But if you weren't aware, as I said, sometimes awareness is really the name of the game. And so if you weren't aware that prices were really that much higher, you certainly are now, and potentially have made some adjustments, particularly when we think about kind of these lower value products like ground beef that's used in a lot of these kind of add-on for people to get protein, and is where it's kind of the market's kind of focused on. So definitely to be interesting to see, because over the last several months, we've really kind of pointed to consumer demand as being the real primary driver for keeping prices higher. And if consumers start to kind of back off of that a little bit, can definitely see prices, continue to remain lower going into the end of the fourth quarter of this year and into the first quarter of 2026.
Recently, many different things have been in the headlines for the cattle market. And one more thing to add to that list, Secretary Rollins recently making an announcement when it comes to New World Screwworm.
Yeah, so she announced the opening of a sterile fly site and dispersal site in Tampico, essentially trying to give some responsiveness to this northern Mexico kind of push, and really try to put sterile flies into the air so that we can control New World Screwworm. I mean, this is a larger issue when we think about kind of how we're actually controlling New World Screwworm. They're going to be releasing about 100 million sterile flies per week into Mexico by aerial operation. So essentially, now it provides a lot more coverage. So efforts are being made by USDA to kind of keep New World Screwworm out of the United States. We have inactive cases in Nuevo León, which is pretty close to the Texan border. And so this is a real issue that if it comes into the United States could really impact the industry and lead to a much larger effort. So I'm glad that the USDA is really kind of taking a stance on that.
And one more thing to add to our stack of headlines, announcement for an investigation for the meatpacking industry.
Yeah, this also came out this week that Attorney Bondi is going to be investigating the meatpacking industry. Now, this kind of comes on the heels of a past investigation that was really started in 2020 by President Trump, where he announced that he was going to look into the Big Four. Now, that time was a little bit different, right? If we think back to 2020 and why we had higher meat prices, we were dealing with kind of COVID at that time. That momentum was really carried, because of that, was carried into the new administration. President Biden at the time had a large effort to essentially have meat packing transparency. There were some good things that came out of kind of that continuation. When we think about new reports that came out, now we have the formula base price being reported. It was already being collected under USDA MPR, but because of the conversation we started having about base prices and negotiated base, they started to release a base price, formula base price, rather than just a formula net price. Some additional reports as far as cattle transparency. And when we think about it, we had the larger conversation about, the cattle contract library, which was a report of collecting all the formulas and putting it out where producers can see how that base price is being set up. I think some of the timing of where this is coming on the back of an Argentina announcement that kind of decreased trade, higher consumer beef prices, and then kind of once again putting it on the back of the packers seems to be, adding up from at least the political sequencing of how they would do that. But will remain, what actually comes of this. A month ago, we had two major packers settle outside of court with no fault admittance on settlements for price fixing allegations. So these things tend to be kind of come up. I think the important distinction here was it tends to come on the back of higher beef prices, which tends to be more of the administration kind of leaning into saying, hey, we're going to protect consumers, whereas in the previous announcement from Trump in his first term was more about consumers or producers feeling like they weren't getting a fair shake and really kind of blaming the packers there. So different dynamics this time from when the investigation is. We'll see what ends up happening with this investigation, but certainly shows that this combined with Secretary Rollins' announcement on other measures like grazing and meat packer development and a lot of these other issues and her plan to kind of combat beef prices is all this has been really kind of a interesting policy time for the beef industry, one that we haven't really seen in quite a while.
So, Elliott, if you had to pick, what are the couple of main things you're keeping your eye on?
At least from the production standpoint, as we go into this fall, going to be looking at heifer retention. I'm keeping a pretty strong eye on cattle receipts and what specifically the percentage of heifers that are going through auction barns. With this, I think one thing we have to appreciate is that more and more feeder cattle are starting to be sold direct transactions or private negotiations. That really weakens our price signal of how much volume is actually going through, because all of those direct transitions are essentially voluntarily reported to USDA. And so at least that's the number one thing that I'm watching on. And then specifically, I'm on a daily, at least weekly basis, looking at value of gains. Like, where is the value out there to put on weight? Is it bringing them from 525s to 625s, or is it trying to buy heavier cattle and put additional weight on? So definitely need to pencil out things this year and just understand kind of the market situation and where you think value is going to be had in the market.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing different textiles that farmers and ranchers or anyone could choose from. And then to talk about it, we're joined by Assistant Professor of Fashion Studies in the College of Health and Human Sciences, Kelsie Doty, and PhD student in Fashion Studies at K-State, Reannan Boisvert. Reannan, Kelsie, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having us. This is wonderful.
Kelsie, as we're talking about different textiles, what different options are there?
We actually have a good variety of options. And so I actually grew up in Kansas. I grew up in a deer stand, and I know how important it is to wear the right textiles for the right environment. So when you are thinking about your basic textiles that are available to you, you can kind of think of two big families. You have synthetic textiles. These are textiles that are made out of petroleum, and so things like polyester and nylon are synthetic. And then we have natural fibers. And natural fiber textiles are things like cotton, linen, wool. So they come from plants or animals. So we have those two big broad categories to pick from. Within that, if you think about natural fibers, you can kind of break them up between plant fibers and animal fibers, because those two families in particular really make a difference for like what time of year you want to wear them. And so plant type fibers like cotton, linen, hemp, any of those, good for hot weather, great for hot weather. Meanwhile, your animal fibers, more like wool, mohair, even silk, can be really good for colder weather.
When we then think about those, do you have a favorite?
Oh, absolutely. I love wool. I'm a huge wool proponent. I love Kansas grown wool in particular, but if I can't get it from Kansas, I do love like smart wool socks, smart wool base layers. I'm a big fan.
Right now it's not super cold, but it will be getting colder as we enter into the end of the year and our winter months. What's your top choice for staying warm?
So I think for staying warm, wool in general is always going to be that number one choice, but we can also take the environment into consideration and really think about what is necessary at this time. So if we are working with layers, I think we often recommend that people layer for the cold weather, for the rainy weather, the wet season, and a different fiber might be appropriate for each of the different layers. So for our base layers, we want something that's going to be knit and very close to the skin. We will most likely want something that is made of possibly one of those animal fibers like wool, because wool has these really great natural properties that helps to wick moisture away, wick water vapor away from the body, while also helping to keep the body warm, help to stabilize temperature. But we also have this in a lot of our synthetic fibers as well. A lot of our synthetics, like polyester, have been engineered to move moisture away from the body. So for that first layer, we want something that is very warm. We want something that's fitted, but also provides a good wicking, moisture management, dry zone next to the skin.
What about additional layers?
So we actually are big fans of a 3-layer system. So you have your first base layer right next to the skin. Again, when it gets cold, it's best to have either a wool type fiber or a synthetic. If it's a little warm out, if it's like now, like in the 40s and 50s, you can get away with a cotton base layer. However, when it gets really cold, avoid the cotton layers because cotton hangs on to moisture, and that can actually be really dangerous, particularly in Kansas when you get a wind chill of -30. That's not great. So stick with wool or a synthetic base layer. And then you're going to have a mid layer. This mid layer is really important to help kind of keep air kind of entrapped next to your body. Air is actually our best thermal insulator. It's the best thing at keeping us warm. And if you have a still layer barrier of air between your base layer and your mid layer, you're going to have a much better time out in the cold. And then you're going to have an external layer, your big coat over all of that. And that's going to be the thing that kind of seals in those, be the top part of all 3 layers. And that's what's going to keep you really nice and toasty in the coldest months in Kansas when you have to go check on calves, right? Because we all know that's going to be happening soon.
So with that, is there a similar system when it comes to staying dry?
For staying dry, we would actually recommend you make use of the exterior layer. So the exterior layer has the most, I think, power for keeping someone dry or keeping someone protected from those elements. A lot of times we like to choose a dense exterior layer like a nylon or a denim or something that just the surface area has these yarns that are so packed in that the air or the water cannot get in. So our exterior layers, we might want to see something like denim, duck, or again, that nylon with possibly a coating on it, a water repellent coating to help keep the rain off. And going back to the duck, that is a fabric type that is not like duck down.
When it comes to staying dry, it's always better to try and prevent yourself from getting wet than trying to then, dry off later when you are in the middle of a field or you're in the middle of work. And so just make sure you have that like raincoat or some nice outer layer with you, like stuffed in your truck or somewhere, so you can just throw that on over something is the best kind of management you could do.
I feel like we've mentioned wool quite a few times in this interview, and would that be your top choice then when we think about durability as well?
Yes, so there are some great options for base layers. Like I said, I do find there's actually silk base layers. Has anyone seen silk long underwear? That does exist, and it's a pretty good base layer for cold winter, but I don't find it very durable. I've tried it. I wore through that in a season, and I wasn't very impressed. Wool base layers has been the thing that has lasted over many winters, but some of your synthetics will last a while too. So my first choice is wool, but I think a synthetic base layer for cold weather is a good second choice.
And nylon is our strongest fiber that we typically see in a consumer market. So anything that is constructed with nylon, we can expect it to be durable, to hold up over time, which is part of why we see so many of our exterior layers like raincoats being made of the nylon, because then it is resistant to abrasion, resistant to tears, cuts, that sort of thing. And we also see often that nylon is mixed in with wool, possibly in socks or in the base layers, again, to help provide a little bit of extra durability, extra stretch that the wool might not naturally have. So a lot of times we enhance our natural fibers with our potentially stronger synthetic fibers.
Is all wool the same wool?
No, good question. There are lots of different types of wool, and some are much scratchier than others. if you are looking for something to wear next to the skin, try and find merino wool. It'll be on the label almost all of the time. Merino wool has a very fine fiber. It's what we call micron count. And so merino wool is great for things that you want to wear right up next to your body. Now you could find a scratcher wool for like an outer sweater to wear over that, but not all wool is the same.
So while we're thinking about staying warm, important to also, I feel like, talk about our toes. And so is there a fiber or type of sock that you have found in your knowledge with fashion studies that is the go-to choice?
Well, for me, it is Smart Wool socks. That's like a brand of them. Wool socks in general, I find, first of all, they're great at keeping my feet warm. They're a great thermal insulator, but they also just like last a good long while. They last a really long time. And they've really held up over a lot of use for me. So I love a good, solid wool nylon, maybe blended sock. It'll be on the label. You'll see the fiber types, but Smart Wool is definitely a brand I look for often.
And again, with having an air gap, that layer of air helps to trap the heat in there. So a lot of people might think that doubling up on layers in the sock and the shoe might help retain the warmth, but sometimes this can be counterproductive. If you put on so many layers that there's no longer any space between your foot and the sock and the shoe, you might feel the cold transferring into your toes even faster than if you had just left that air gap alone. So I think strategic layering is just as important as the fiber choice, because you don't want to work against that fiber choice by leaving out an air gap. You still want a little bit of that little insulation, air insulation in between.
If you're thinking about staying warm, what would you stay away from?
I would stay away from cotton. I would stay away from any of those plant-based fibers. There's actually a lot of research on this. Like I said before, cotton likes to keep the moisture in itself, which is great when it's hot outside because that causes evaporative cooling. It's like sweating. And so that's great to wear cotton when it's hot out. But when it's cold out, again, it can be really dangerous because that moisture right next to the skin and trapped can cause frostbite. It can cause a lot of issues if it gets really cold out. And if that cold north wind is blowing, you will have issues with some of those cotton layers right next to the skin.
That was K-State Assistant Professor of Fashion Studies in the College of Health and Human Sciences, Kelsie Doty, and she was joined by K-State PhD student in Fashion Studies, Rhiannon Boisvert. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing getting ponds ready for colder temperatures with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, as we're thinking about ponds, first, thinking about fish more specifically, and what do we need to keep in mind for them?
Yeah, this is a great time of year for fish. So they really like water temperatures, or a lot of the species that we have in Kansas, at least, like water temperatures in that 50 to 60 degree range, which is where we're at this time of year. And so they start preparing for winter. We're going to see things like panfish, bluegill, and crappie are going to start to get into really tight schools. So it's a great time to be able to go out and target them. If you can find a school, you can catch a lot of panfish this time of year. Bass are trying to put on some extra weight, and so they're going up into the shallows during the day and feeding, and then they might be on some ledges or drop offs later in the day, but they're out there feeding, trying to put on some weight before the winter weather comes. It's a great time of year in our reservoirs to go out and catch walleye, and so walleye tend to slow down with warmer temperatures, but when we get these cooler temps, they just come to life. And so you're seeing lots of walleye being caught this time of year in our reservoirs. Really great time to just get out and enjoy the fishing opportunities that Kansas has.
Is there anything people need to do for their ponds as it does get colder?
So while the fish are preparing for winter, it's also a great opportunity for us to make sure our ponds are ready. And so, if you're doing any type of management, things like an aeration system should be turned off when the water gets below 55 or 60 degrees. And so we've hit that temperature now. It's a good time to turn off your aeration system. If you're feeding fish, metabolism drops, and so making sure that you're stopping feeding fish, or at the very least reducing the amount of feed that you're throwing out from your feeders. Great time of year to do that. If you don't have those types of things in your pond, it's a great time to, check it out, remove debris. We talked recently about removing leaves from your pond, but other type of debris, big limbs that may have fallen in, some of that might be good habitat. You might want to keep it there, but it's a good time to at least assess what's in your pond and if there's anything you want to remove. It's also a really good time of year to walk around and just check it out one last time before it gets too cold to really see what's going on. And so look for signs of beaver, signs of muskrats, leaks, things like that might just be good chances to kind of take care of your pond before it gets too cold for the year.
You mentioned turning off the aeration system, but is there ever a scenario where maybe it should be left on?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so thinking about, livestock in the winter, they need to have access to a lot of good, fresh water, clean water. And so if it's going to ice over, having aeration might be one way to keep a small area open where they can, get access to that drinking water. It's not going to work if there's really, really cold temperatures, but, it'll help to keep that water moving enough that it'll keep it open if we're near the freezing temperature. So that might be a good time to leave the aerator on. While we're talking about it, it's also good to think about, what can we do to make sure that our livestock have access to clean water? Is the access going to be safe to them throughout the winter? What are we going to do for ice? And so, making sure that we have the ice broken so that there's water for the livestock to drink is important, but also livestock aren't always the smartest. And so especially young livestock might wander out onto the ice and that can be a dangerous, deadly situation. So having a plan to keep everything safe with ice, both drinking water and falling through into the pond, are two things we want to think about now.
And as we're talking about ice on ponds, we always mention, how thick does ice need to be before you go out on a pond?
Yeah, that's the thicker the better, but there's something called a spud bar, which is just basically a big walking stick that you can hit into the ice as you walk, and it will break through or crack if it's not safe. And so I always recommend having one of those if you're going to walk out on the ice to really test it. But the rule of thumb is about 4 inches, and so we want to have 4 inches of ice before we're wandering out on that pond, just to make sure that it's safe.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.